The auctioneer did not want to list it. He had been at it since 9 in the morning, working his way through the estate of Vernon Kirchner, a dairy farmer who had died owing more than his land was worth. The auction was held in a muddy lot outside Friendship, Wisconsin, on the second Saturday of April 1967. By 3 in the afternoon, most of the good equipment had been sold. The milking stanchions went early. The hay elevator brought decent money. A serviceable Oliver plow changed hands for $60, and the crowd murmured approval because 60 was fair. Maybe 40 men stood in the spring mud, hands stuffed into jacket pockets, boot heels sinking slowly into the soft ground, waiting for the last items so they could go home and start evening chores. The auctioneer looked at his clipboard. He looked at the things sitting at the far end of the lot, half hidden behind a pile of cedar fence posts that nobody had bid on either. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at his clipboard again, as if hoping the item might disappear between glances. Folks, last item, 1952, Farmall Super M. No engine, no starter, no generator, no carburetor. She has got wheels and a frame, and that is about the extent of it. Somebody give me $20 for the iron weight. A few men turned to look. Most did not bother. An engineless tractor at a farm auction was not a curiosity. It was a punchline. Someone had pulled the motor out years ago for reasons nobody remembered, and nobody had cared enough to investigate, and the tractor had been sitting in a fence row ever since. Leaves had packed into the hood cavity in layers, one autumn on top of another, compressing into a dark mulch that smelled of rot and tannin. Mice had nested in the wiring channels and chewed through every insulated wire they could reach. Rain had pooled in the bell housing and rusted the clutch plate into a single fused disc of iron oxide that would never turn again. The red paint International Harvester's signature red had faded under years of sun and weather to the color of old brick, chalky and dull flaking at the edges of every panel. You could stand at the front of the tractor and look straight through to the firewall. There was nothing inside. No block, no head, no manifold. Just an empty cavity where 400 pounds of cast iron should have been. A shell, a tin can on wheels. The hood gaped open like a mouth with all its teeth pulled. A scrap dealer named Horvath raised his hand from the back row. 20. The auctioneer nodded, grateful that someone had broken the silence. $20. Do I hear 25, 35, said a voice from the left side of the crowd. Heads turned. The voice belonged to Maren Engstrom. She was 29 years old, 5'7", 130 pounds, standing at the edge of the gathering in work boots and a canvas jacket that had belonged to her father. The jacket was too large for her. It hung past her hips, and the sleeves were rolled twice at the cuffs, but she wore it every day, regardless the way some people wear a wedding ring long after the spouse is gone. Her dark hair was pulled back with a rubber band. Her hands were calloused in patterns that no one in the crowd would have recognized, because the calluses came from machinist's tools, not a farmer's implements. The hard ridges ran along the insides of her fingers, where they gripped lathe handles, and across the heels of her palms, where they pressed against milling machine cranks. Horvath, the scrap dealer, looked at her, calculated the margin between $35 and what the iron would bring at the yard, found the margin to be negative, shrugged and dropped his hand. $35 was more than the scrap was worth. Nobody else bid. Nobody wanted to compete for the privilege of owning a tractor that could not move under its own power. The auctioneer shook his head, marked the sale sheet with a stroke of his pen, and moved on to closing announcements. The crowd began to break apart. Men walked toward their trucks. Engines started in the parking area. The auction was over. Maren walked to the farmall. She moved through the thinning crowd without hurrying, without speaking to anyone, without acknowledging the glances that followed her. She put her hand on the frame rail just below where the hood met the cowl. The steel was cold under her palm, cold from sitting in Wisconsin shade for years, but it was solid, dense. She could feel the weight of the machine through that single point of contact, the way a doctor feels a pulse through fingertips. The frame was heavy, balanced. The wide front axle sat square and true. Despite the years of neglect, the spindles still tight in their bushings, the tie rod ends showing wear, but not failure. The rear end, the transmission housing, and the final drives was International Harvester's best work from the early 50s. Bulletproof gearing designed for a generation of farmers who expected their equipment to last 20 years and would accept nothing less. A rear axle assembly that could absorb twice the torque the factory engine had ever produced without complaint. She was not looking at what was missing. She was looking at what was there. Two men helped her push the farmall onto her flatbed truck. Without the engine, the tractor was light enough that three people could roll it across level ground. She chained it down, checked the chains twice, climbed into the cab of her Ford truck, and pulled out of the lot onto County Road J, heading south toward home. She passed the co-op in Friendship on the way. The co-op was the center of agricultural commerce in Adams County, a cluster of buildings where farmers bought seed and fertilizer and fuel and stood around talking about weather and prices and each other. Dale Sievert's John Deere dealership occupied the lot next door, a cinder block building with a green and yellow sign and a row of new tractors arranged along the frontage like soldiers at inspection. Dale was leaning against the door frame of his showroom, watching the auction traffic roll by the way he always did on sale days, counting trucks, noting who bought what and who went home empty-handed, keeping mental inventory of every farmer's equipment situation within 30 miles, because that was how Dale Sievert sold tractors. He knew who was running old iron. He knew who was one breakdown away from needing a replacement. He knew the rhythms of wear and failure across the entire county the way a weatherman knows pressure systems. He saw the engineless farmall on the flatbed. He recognized the truck. He started laughing before the truck had passed the gas pumps. He was still laughing when he turned to the two men at the parts counter inside the dealership, a grin splitting his face like he had just heard the best joke of the spring. The Engstrom girl just bought a tractor with no engine. I am not joking. No engine. The thing is a shell. You can see straight through it. A tin can with wheels. What is she going to do with it? One of the men at the counter, a farmer named Hollis, who was waiting for a set of plow bolts, shrugged and said, "Farm with it, probably. She farms 140 acres with junk nobody else would touch. This is just the latest piece of her collection. You cannot farm with a tractor that has got no engine, Dale. Tell Marin that. See how far you get." By the end of that week, Adams County had a new joke. Marin Engstrom bought a tractor with no engine. What is next? A combine with no header, a plow with no blades, a barn with no roof. The jokes came easy and spread fast the way they always do when a quiet person does something nobody understands. And the jokes came easier still because the quiet person was a woman working a machine shop alone on a sandy farm that everyone agreed should have been sold 2 years ago when her father died, and because the people telling the jokes had never once set foot in that machine shop and had no idea what was inside it. But the people laughing did not know what Marin knew. They did not know about the engine she had already bought 6 months earlier, and they did not know about the blueprint she had found on her dead father's workbench. Let me tell you about the engine first, because this is where the timeline bends backward and the story begins to make a different kind of sense. 6 months before the auction in October of 1966, Marin had driven 40 miles north to Fort McCoy. Fort McCoy was the Army base outside Tama, Wisconsin, and it held surplus sales 4 times a year. The military sold off decommissioned equipment in lots pallets, stacked in a fenced yard behind the motor pool, everything tagged and numbered and priced to move. Trucks with flat tires and cracked windshields. Generator sets that had been superseded by newer models. Toolkits, canvas tarps, mess hall equipment, signal wire. Anything the Army no longer needed sold to civilians for pennies on the dollar. Farmers in central Wisconsin had been buying military surplus for decades. A man could outfit half a farm operation from Army cast-offs if he knew what to look for and did not mind olive drab paint on everything he owned. Marin knew what to look for. She had been looking for it since the previous spring when she had found the blueprint in her father's workshop. But the blueprint comes later. The engine comes first. She arrived at Fort McCoy on a Tuesday morning in October. The surplus yard was open to civilians from 8 to 4. She signed in at the gate, showed her driver's license, and walked the rows of pallets under a gray Wisconsin sky that promised rain but had not yet delivered. She moved slowly, reading tags, checking serial numbers, ignoring the trucks and the canvas and the mess equipment. She was looking for one specific thing: a Continental CD 193 diesel engine, 4 cylinders, 193 cubic inches of displacement, rated by the Army at 48 horsepower, which was a number Marin knew to be conservative because her father had examined one of these engines at a surplus sale in 1961 and told her the truth about it. That engine makes 55, maybe 60 horsepower. If you tune it right, Gunner had said, standing in the surplus yard at Camp Douglas, turning the crankshaft of a CD 193 by hand and listening to the compression. The Army rates everything low. Reliability margins. They want an engine rated at 50 to actually make 60, so it never works hard, so it never breaks. The real output is higher than the tag says. More importantly, the CD193 was a diesel. The Farmall Super M had come from the factory with a 264 cubic inch gasoline engine, making 44 horsepower at the drawbar. Gas engines had their virtues, but economy was not among them. They burned expensive fuel. They wore out faster. The spark ignition system added complexity and failure points. A diesel, by contrast, ran on cheaper fuel, lasted longer, made more torque at low RPM, and ignited its fuel through compression alone. No spark plugs, no distributor, no points to wear and go out of adjustment. Exactly the characteristics you needed for heavy pulling in sandy Wisconsin soil, where the ground grabbed at plow bottoms like wet cement, and the tractor that survived was the tractor that could lug through resistance without stalling. Marin found her engine on the third row of pallets. It was sitting next to a dead generator set, the generator housing dented and corroded, the whole unit tagged for disposal. The Continental engine was still bolted to its mounting frame inside the generator housing, covered in Army olive drab paint that was chipped at the edges but intact across the casting surfaces. The tag wired to the lifting eye read, "Serviceable. Removed for unit replacement." She read the tag twice. Serviceable. The Army had pulled a working engine out of a generator set simply because the generator itself was obsolete, superseded by a newer model. The generator was junk. The engine inside it was fine. A perfectly good diesel discarded because the machine it served was no longer needed. Marin understood that feeling better than she wanted to admit. She knew what it was like to be functional inside a frame the world had written off. She found the surplus yard sergeant, a thick-necked staff sergeant named Kowalski, who ran the civilian sales with the bored efficiency of a man who had been doing the same job for 15 years. She asked him about the Continental. He pulled the inventory sheet, confirmed it was tagged serviceable, and quoted her a price: $85. $85 for a running diesel engine that would have cost $1,200 new from Continental Motors in Muskegon, Michigan. $85 for an engine that made more power on cheaper fuel with longer service life than the $400 gasoline engine that International Harvester had designed for the Farmall Super M. Marin wrote a check. Sergeant Kowalski helped her rig a chain hoist to lift the engine out of the generator housing and onto the bed of her truck. He helped because he was curious about the young woman buying a surplus diesel and asking technical questions about injector timing and compression ratios that most of his own motor pool mechanics could not have answered. He had been selling surplus to farmers for years, and the farmers usually pointed at a pallet and said how much. They did not ask about fuel injection pressures. The engine sat on her truck bed, 400 pounds of cast iron and steel olive drab, and anonymous, a military heart, waiting for a civilian body. Marin drove it home and parked it in her father's workshop next to the milling machine. Now she had the engine. She just needed the tractor to put it in. She waited 6 months. She farmed through the summer and fall of '66, running the old equipment her father had built and rebuilt over 30 years of stubborn, ingenious, relentless tinkering. She studied the blueprint in the evenings, making her own calculations, her own notes, her own lists of materials and dimensions and clearances. She checked the auction notices in the Adams County newspaper every week, looking for a Farmall Super M frame. She needed the frame to be empty. A tractor with a seized engine would mean hours of removal work and an engine she did not want. A tractor with a running engine would cost too much and come with the wrong power plant. She needed a shell, just the frame, the transmission, the axles, the wheels, the bones of the machine, without the heart. In March of 1967, she saw the listing in the auction notice. Kirchner Estate, Friendship. Equipment list included one line that made her pulse quicken: 1952 Farmall Super M no engine. She read it twice. Then she folded the paper, put it in the pocket of her father's canvas jacket, and went to the workshop to check the blueprint one more time. On the second Saturday of April, she drove to Friendship and paid $35 for a tractor that nobody else wanted. $35 for the frame, $85 for the engine, $120 total. Dale Sievert's cheapest John Deere was $7,400. She drove home past the co-op where Dale was laughing, past the gas station where farmers were shaking their heads, past the fence lines of neighbors who had been telling her to sell for 2 years, neighbors who saw a 29-year-old woman alone on bad ground with dead man's tools and thought they were watching a slow-motion failure. She drove home, backed the flatbed up to the workshop door, unchained the farmall, and rolled it into the bay where her father's first tractor, the one he had built from a Model A engine and railroad rail in 1934, had been assembled 33 years earlier. She pinned the blueprint to the wall above the milling machine. She picked up a wrench, and in the silence of her father's workshop, with her father's tools hanging on the walls, and her father's last project spread out in mechanical pencil on drafting paper, above her head Maren Engstrom began to build. Now let me tell you about Gunnar Engstrom, because the engine Maren put in, that farmall, only makes sense if you understand the man who taught her to think about machines. Gunnar was born in 1903 in a small town outside Stuttgart, in the part of southwestern Germany, where precision metalworking was not merely an industry, but a tradition passed down through families like a language. The region produced machinists the way the American Midwest produced farmers, steadily, reliably, generation after generation. Gunnar apprenticed at a machine works from the age of 14, learning to cut metal to tolerances that most people cannot perceive without instruments. He learned the lathe first because the lathe is the mother of all machine tools, the one from which every other metalworking operation descends. Then the milling machine, then the surface grinder, then the forge and the heat treatment furnace, and the art of hardening steel so that it holds an edge or bears a load without yielding. By 20, he could operate any machine tool built in Europe. By 25, he could design and build machine tools himself from raw castings and bar stock, creating the very instruments that created other things. He was a maker of makers, a man who understood that every manufactured object in the world, every bridge and every engine and every rifle and every sewing machine, began with someone who knew how to cut metal to a line. He came to America in 1928 not because Germany lacked opportunity for machinists, but because his older brother Carl had written from Wisconsin about cheap land and a new country and the feeling of owning ground that belonged to you and not to a landlord or a government or the memory of a war. Gunnar arrived in Adams County with a machinist's tool chest that weighed more than his suitcase, $400 in savings, and almost no English. He bought 140 acres of sandy, marginal ground south of Friendship. The soil was poor. The established farmers, the ones with the good bottom land along the creeks and rivers, did not want it. That was why Gunnar could afford it. He never made much money farming. The sandy Wisconsin soil was not built for high yields. It drained too fast, held too little moisture, let nutrients leach away with every rain. 80 bushels of corn in a good year, 60 in a bad one, and some years worse than that. But what Gunnar lacked in income, he made up for in the ability to build anything the farm needed from whatever materials were available. He built his own equipment, not modified equipment, not equipment with aftermarket parts or dealer add-ons. Built from nothing. From scrap and surplus, in bar stock, in castings, in the contents of his own mind. His first tractor was assembled in 1934 from a Model A Ford engine pulled from a wrecked car, a truck transmission bought at a junkyard in Portage, and a frame he welded from railroad rail that he cut with a hacksaw and shaped on the forge. The tractor looked like something from a fever dream, all odd angles and improvised brackets, unpainted with no sheet metal covering the mechanical works. It looked like the skeleton of a tractor, the bones without the skin. But it plowed straight. It did not break. And it cost Gunnar $22 in parts in a month of winter evenings in the shop. Over the next 30 years, he built or rebuilt every piece of machinery on the farm. Plows designed for his specific soil conditions. Cultivators with row spacing matched to his planting patterns. A grain wagon with a hydraulic dump bed fabricated from a log truck cylinder he bought at a scrapyard in Wausau. A hay rake with a mechanical action he designed himself, smoother and more reliable than the commercial models that cost 10 times as much. Neighbors came from 20 miles to stare at his creations, half in admiration and half in disbelief, the way people visit a folk art museum. They could see the ingenuity. They could not quite believe anyone would go to such lengths when a man could simply buy a tractor from a dealer and be done with it. But buying from a dealer required money that Gunnar did not have. Building in the shop required skill that Gunnar did have. The equation was simple. The execution was not. The workshop was the center of everything. It occupied a concrete-floored building behind the farmhouse 40 feet by 60 with a 14-foot ceiling that allowed room for a chain hoist and a steel I-beam Gunner had installed for lifting engines and transmissions. The walls were lined with steel shelving he had welded from angle iron, and every shelf was organized with the same precision Gunner applied to his machining. Boxes of fasteners sorted by type and size. Bins of raw material, steel and aluminum and brass arranged by alloy and dimension. Drawers of cutting tools, reamers, and taps and dies, and end mills, each one in its labeled slot. The machines were the heart of the shop. A South Bend lathe he had bought in 1947 from a bankrupt machine shop in Milwaukee, a 16-inch swing model with a quick-change gearbox that could cut any thread pitch from 4 to 224 per inch. A Bridgeport milling machine he had found as a wreck at an industrial auction and rebuilt over the course of a winter, replacing the worn ways, scraping the table flat, rebushing the spindle, until the machine cut as true as the day it left the Bridgeport factory in Connecticut. A coal forge he had built from a brake drum and a hand-crank blower. A welding setup with both oxyacetylene and electric arc capability, and enough precision measuring instruments, micrometers and dial indicators, and bore gauges, and surface plates to equip a professional inspection department. Neighbors came from 20 miles to have Gunner make parts that could not be bought anymore. Obsolete castings for discontinued machinery. Custom brackets for non-standard applications. Gears and shafts and bushings that the dealer said did not exist, that the factory had stopped producing years ago that could not be found in any catalog. Gunner made them exist. He took measurements from the broken part, drew the replacement on drafting paper, set up the lathe or the mill, and cut a new one from bar stock. He charged almost nothing because the work itself was the payment, the satisfaction of solving a problem that no one else could solve. Marin was his only child. Lorraine, her mother, had wanted more children, had prayed for them in the Lutheran church in Friendship every Sunday for years, but the children did not come. So Gunner taught Marin what he would have taught a son because the knowledge had to go somewhere. Knowledge that is not passed down dies with the man who holds it, and Gunner could not bear the idea of his skills ending when his hands stopped moving. Metal did not care who held the wrench. The lathe did not know if the hands on its handles belonged to a man or a woman. Only the skill mattered, only the precision. By 12, Marin could run the lathe, not play with it, run it, turning steel to dimension with the steady hand and the measured eye that the work demanded. Reading the micrometer to a tenth of a thousandth of an inch, translating those tiny numbers into the real-world difference between a part that fit and a part that failed. Adjusting feed rates by sound, because a lathe cutting properly makes a particular hiss and a lathe cutting too aggressively or too lightly makes a different sound entirely. And Gunner taught her to hear the difference before she could articulate what it meant. By 15, she could weld as well as her father. Gas welding and arc welding, both laying beads on steel plate, so uniform that you could not tell where one pass ended and the next began. The key to welding, Gunner told her, is patience. The metal wants to join. You are not forcing it. You are giving it permission. Your job is to control the heat, maintain the arc, feed the rod at the right speed, and let the metal do what metal does. By 18, she understood metallurgy, heat treatment, and dimensional tolerances, the way most farm kids understood planting dates and fertilizer rates. She knew that 4140 steel could be hardened to Rockwell 60, but would be brittle above 55. She knew that aluminum expanded faster than steel when heated, and that this difference could be used to shrink fit a bearing onto a shaft. She knew that a thousandth of an inch was the thickness of a human hair, and that the difference between a thousandth and 2 thousandths was the difference between a machine that ran smooth and a machine that destroyed itself. Gunner did not just teach her how to make parts. He taught her how to think about machines. To see a tractor not as a fixed design from a factory, not as a finished product that came into the world complete and immutable, but as a collection of systems that could be reimagined, recombined, improved. An engine was not sacred. A transmission was not permanent. A frame was not married to the components the factory had chosen to install. Everything was separable. Everything was replaceable. Everything could be made better if you understood the systems well enough to see the possibilities. A factory builds what they can sell. Gunnar told her one evening in the shop while she was facing a coupling on the lathe. The blue-white chips of steel curled away from the cutting tool and fell into the chip pan with a sound like tiny bells. A machinist builds what he needs. The factory is limited by profit. They build what the most customers will buy, not what any single customer actually requires. The machinist is limited only by what he knows, and what he knows he can build. Maren was 27 when Gunnar died. November of 1965. Heart attack. It happened in the shop, the only place it could have happened, because the shop was where Gunnar spent every hour that the farm did not claim. He was rebuilding a hydraulic control valve for the tractor's three-point hitch, a job that required removing a dozen small springs and check balls and reassembling them in the correct sequence. They found him on the concrete floor beside the milling machine. The wrench was still in his right hand. His left hand was resting on the base of the lathe as if he had reached out in the last moment to steady himself against the only thing in the world he trusted to be perfectly true. Maren inherited the farm, the workshop, and every tool her father had spent 30 years collecting and maintaining and arranging on those shelves with such care. She also inherited his way of seeing machines. And his loneliness, though she did not recognize that part yet. Loneliness for the Angstroms looked like work. It looked like staying in the shop until midnight. It looked like precision applied to metal because precision could not be applied to grief. The months after Gunnar's death were the worst of Maren's life. Not because of the grief alone, though the grief was constant, a presence in every room of the house, in every corner of the shop, in every row of the fields where she could see her father's work, in every furrow and every fence line. The months were the worst because of the silence. The shop was silent. No lathe running, no mill cutting, no forge hissing. The sounds that had filled Maren's life since childhood, the background music of a machinist's household, were gone. The house was silent. Lorraine had moved to her sister's place in Wisconsin Rapids 2 weeks after the funeral, unable to stay in the house where her husband had lived for 37 years and died on a Tuesday afternoon with his hand on a wrench. Maren understood why her mother left. She did not blame her, but the understanding did not fill the empty rooms. Maren was alone on 140 acres of sandy ground with a workshop full of tools and no one to talk to about what to do with them. The farm needed tending. She tended it. The corn needed planting. She planted it. The machinery needed maintenance. She maintained it. The fences needed repair before winter. She repaired them. But she did these things the way a person breathes automatically without thought, without the feeling of choosing to do them. She was keeping the farm alive without being alive on it herself. She was maintaining systems the way her father had taught her. But the system that needed maintaining, most the one inside herself, had no blueprint and no spare parts. Neighbors offered to buy the land. They were not vultures. They were practical men who saw a young woman alone on marginal ground and made a practical calculation. Dale Sievert told anyone who would listen at the co-op that Maren should sell before the equipment depreciated further. A real estate man from Wisconsin Rapids called the house twice in January, and once in February, his voice smooth and sympathetic on the telephone, explaining that the market for agricultural land in Adams County was softening and that waiting would only reduce her options. Lorraine called every Sunday evening and asked the same question in different words. How long are you going to do this? When are you going to come to your senses? Your father worked himself to death on that farm, Maren. Are you going to do the same thing? Lorraine never said sell. She said think about your future. She said there is more to life than sandy ground. She said your father loved you, but he would not want you to be alone out there. The words were different each Sunday. The meaning was the same. In February of 1966, 3 months after Gunnar's death, Maren picked up the telephone on a Monday morning and called the real estate man in Wisconsin Rapids. She told him she was ready to list the property. He said he would drive out the following Monday to take photographs and write up the listing. She hung up the phone. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking out the window at the workshop. The building was dark. She had not turned on the lights in there for 2 weeks. On Sunday night, the night before the real estate man was scheduled to arrive, Maren could not sleep. She lay in bed in the dark, listening to the farmhouse settle and creak in the February cold, listening to the wind push against the windows, listening to the silence where her father's voice should have been. At 2 in the morning, she got up, pulled on her boots and the canvas jacket, and walked across the frozen yard to the workshop. She turned on the overhead lights. The fluorescent tubes flickered and buzzed, and then caught filling the shop with the flat, shadowless light that Gunnar had preferred because it showed the true surface of metal without the distortions that incandescent bulbs created. The shop looked exactly as it had looked the day Gunnar died. The lathe, the mill, the forge, the welding table, the pegboard walls hung with wrenches and hammers and files and specialty tools in the exact positions Gunnar had assigned them, each tool outlined in black marker, so you could see at a glance if anything was missing. The concrete floor was clean because Gunnar had swept it every night of his working life, and Maren had continued sweeping it each time she entered, even when she had no reason to enter, even when the entering was a form of worship she could not name. She walked to the workbench. The bench was a slab of maple 3 inches thick that Gunnar had planed and finished in 1949. Its surface was marked with decades of use, small dents and scratches and burn marks from hot metal, but it was level and solid, and it would be level and molded 100 years from now. That was when she saw the drafting paper. It was pinned under a coffee can full of quarter 20 bolts half hidden by a stack of old machinery catalogs. She had walked past it a dozen times since November, without noticing it because it looked like just another piece of the shop's accumulation, another layer of the sediment that 30 years of work deposits in a workspace. She pulled it free and unrolled it on the bench. The paper was 24 by 36 inches, standard drafting size, the kind Gunnar bought in rolls from a supply house in Milwaukee. On it in Gunnar's precise mechanical pencil was a diagram. It showed a Farmall Super M frame drawn in profile, and from above with critical dimensions marked at every structural point. Next to it, drawn to the same scale with the same precise hand, was a Continental CD 193 diesel engine, its outline taken from the manufacturer's specification sheet, but redrawn by Gunnar, with additional dimensions that Continental had not published, dimensions that could only have been obtained by measuring an actual engine with calipers and micrometers. Between the two drawings connecting them was a third element, an adapter plate, drawn in cross-section and plan view, dimensioned down to the thousandth of an inch with bolt patterns for both the Continental bell housing and the Farmall transmission case, drawn in overlapping circles that showed exactly where each hole must be bored to mate the two machines together. Crankshaft flange specifications, flywheel clearances, pilot bore diameter, mounting pad locations, everything needed to install a military surplus diesel engine in a Farmall Super M frame. In the lower right corner of the drawing in Gunnar's handwriting, small and precise and unmistakable, were the words CD193 in Super M frame, 55 to 60 horsepower estimated, diesel fuel economy, project notes C folder. There was no folder. Maren searched the shop for a week, going through every drawer, every shelf, every filing cabinet, every box of papers Gunnar had accumulated over 3 decades. If he had kept additional notes on the project, they were lost. Perhaps he had never started the folder. Perhaps the blueprint was as far as he had gotten before his heart stopped. But the blueprint was enough. The critical dimensions were there. The concept was complete. The adapter plate was fully specified. Her father had been planning this conversion before he died. He had been working toward it, thinking about it, drawing it with the same precision he applied to every machine's surface. He had not finished. He had run out of time, the way all mortal machinists eventually run out of time, no matter how carefully they measure. Maren stood in the shop holding the blueprint. The fluorescent lights hummed. The building ticked and settled in the cold. She could feel her father's presence, not his ghost, but his intention. The blueprint was a message, a set of instructions left behind by a man who knew perhaps that he would not be the one to follow them. A last project, an unfinished sentence that only she had the skills and the knowledge and the tools to complete. She pinned the blueprint to the wall above the milling machine, in the spot where Gunnar had always pinned his current project drawings. She called the real estate man at 7 on Monday morning and told him not to come. She told him she had changed her mind. She told him the farm was not for sale. She called Lorraine at 8. "I am not selling, Mama. I found something Papa was working on. I am going to finish it." Lorraine was quiet on the line for 10 seconds. Then she said what she always said, what she had been saying since November in different phrasings, all arriving at the same destination. "Your father is dead, Maren. You cannot bring him back by staying on that farm. I am not trying to bring him back. I am trying to finish what he started. And what did he start? A better machine. Lorraine sighed the way she had been sighing since 1965. The long exhale of a woman who loved her husband and loved her daughter and could not understand either of them, could not comprehend the pull that a workshop and a set of tools and a sheet of drafting paper could exert on a human soul. Marin hung up the phone. She walked back to the workshop. She stood in front of the blueprint and began to plan. 6 months later, she bought the Continental diesel at Fort McCoy. 6 months after that, she bought the Engineless Farmall at the Kirchner auction. The plan was complete. The pieces were assembled. All that remained was the work. The Continental C2193 did not fit the Farmall Super M. Of course it did not. No two machines designed by different companies in different factories for different purposes in different decades were ever meant to share a frame. The engine mounts were different. The bell housing bolt pattern was different. The crankshaft flange diameter was different. The cooling system, the fuel system, the electrical system, the exhaust routing, the air intake, the oil filtration, nothing matched. Every connection point between the Continental engine and the Farmall frame was a mismatch. Every bolt hole was in the wrong place. Every dimension was off by just enough to make the installation impossible by any conventional method. A dealer would have looked at the two pieces sitting in that workshop and said it could not be done. Go buy a tractor that runs. A factory engineer would have run the compatibility specifications and reached the same conclusion. The tolerances are incompatible. The bolt patterns do not align. The project is not merely difficult, it is by any reasonable engineering standard impossible. Marin did not operate by reasonable engineering standards. She operated by thousandths of an inch and the knowledge her father had spent a lifetime teaching her. She had the blueprint. She had the tools. She had the dimensions. And she had the winter ahead of her, the long Wisconsin winter, when the fields were frozen and the days were short, and the only productive place on a farm was inside a heated workshop with a lathe and a milling machine, and a piece of metal that needed to be made into something it was not yet. She started in May of '67 as soon as the corn was planted and the spring fieldwork was done. The days were long enough now that she could finish chores by 6 in the evening and still have 3 or 4 hours of usable time in the shop before exhaustion forced her to stop. She began with the most critical component, the adapter plate. The adapter plate was the keystone of the entire conversion. A single piece of steel 1 inch thick that would bolt to the Farmall transmission bell housing on one side and mate to the Continental engine on the other. It had to speak two mechanical languages simultaneously, translating between an American farm tractor from 1952 and a military industrial diesel engine from 1961, making them think they had been designed for each other, when in fact they had never met. The tolerances were extraordinary. The pilot bore the central hole through which the transmission input shaft would pass had to be concentric with the engine's crankshaft to within half a thousandth of an inch, half a thousandth. The thickness of a sheet of newspaper divided by 10. If the bore was off by more than that, the crankshaft and the input shaft would not be aligned. The universal joint, if one were used, would cycle through uneven angles. The bearings would load unevenly. The vibration would build season after season until something cracked or seized or shook itself free at the worst possible moment. The bolt holes had to match two different patterns. The Continental bell housing used a metric bolt circle derived from its German-influenced industrial heritage. The Farmall transmission case used an SAE pattern based on American standards. The holes in the adapter plate had to accommodate both positioned so that the plate could be bolted to the Farmall with one set of fasteners and to the Continental with another, each set tight, each set properly torqued, each set carrying its share of the load without interference. The faces of the plate had to be flat to within a thousandth of an inch across the entire surface. Not approximately flat, not close to flat, flat to a thousandth verified by a surface plate and a dial indicator, because any deviation in flatness would become a wobble in the rotating assembly, and a wobble in a spinning drivetrain is a crack waiting to happen. Marin started with a slab of hot-rolled steel plate from a supply house in Stevens Point. She rough-cut the circle on a bandsaw, leaving a 1/4 inch of excess material on every edge. Then she moved to the milling machine, the Bridgeport that Gunner had rebuilt from wreckage 20 years ago, and began the slow process of machining the plate to final dimensions. She squared the faces first. This meant clamping the rough disc to the mill table, running a fly cutter across the surface, and removing a few thousandths of an inch per pass. After each pass, she unclamped the plate, set it on the surface plate, and swept a dial indicator across the machined face, watching the needle for any deviation. When one side was flat, she flipped the plate and repeated the process on the other side. Then she began boring the pilot hole. She started with a center drill to establish the exact location, checked the position with the dial indicator, adjusted the table by half a thousandth, checked again, and then began drilling. She worked up through progressively larger drill bits, each one removing more material and getting closer to the final dimension until she reached the point where the drill bits were too large for the precision required. Then she switched to a boring bar, a single-point cutting tool that removed metal in increments of 0.002 per pass each pass, checked with a bore gauge before the next cut was made. She measured constantly. Micrometer for outside dimensions. Bore gauge for the pilot hole. Dial indicator for concentricity and flatness. Surface plate for reference. She checked and rechecked every dimension against the numbers on Gunner's blueprint and against the measurements she had taken herself from both the Continental bell housing and the Farmall transmission case measurements she had recorded in a notebook with the same precision her father had used. 3 weeks she spent on the adapter plate alone. 3 weeks of evenings and weekends standing at the Bridgeport cutting metal with the patience that the work demanded and that Gunner had taught her was not optional. Patience in machining is not a virtue. It is a structural requirement. The metal does not care if you are in a hurry. The metal cares only that you cut it correctly. On a Thursday evening in late May, she finished the final boring pass on the pilot hole and ran the dial indicator one last time. The needle did not move. Dead center. She checked the bolt hole positions against both patterns, Continental and Farmall. Every hole was within half a thousandth of its specified location. She laid the plate on the surface plate and swept the indicator across both faces. Less than 1,000th of deviation across the full diameter of the plate. She ran her fingertips across the machine's surface. The steel was smooth as still water. She could feel her father in the precision of it, in the way the metal had yielded exactly the way it was supposed to yield, because she had cut it exactly the way it was supposed to be cut. This was what Gunner meant when he said the machinist is limited only by what he knows. Marin knew enough. The plate was proof. She set it on the workbench and allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction. One deep breath, one look at the blueprint on the wall. Then she moved on to the next problem. The flywheel adapter was the second critical piece, and it scared her more than the plate. The Continental crankshaft flange was smaller in diameter than the bore of the Farmall flywheel. The engine and the transmission were designed to rotate at the same speed, to transfer the same power to do the same fundamental job, but the physical interface between them was incompatible. They spoke different mechanical languages at the exact point where rotational energy had to pass from one to the other. Marin needed to build a translator. She machined a stepped collar from a solid billet of 4140 chrome molybdenum steel, a high-strength alloy that could withstand the torsional stresses of a diesel engine without fatiguing over thousands of hours of service. The collar bolted to the Continental crankshaft flange on one end and presented the correct diameter and bolt pattern for the Farmall flywheel and clutch assembly on the other. It was a precision coupling, a mechanical handshake between two machines that had never been introduced. The danger was balance. A flywheel spinning at 2,000 revolutions per minute is a gyroscope. It stores enormous rotational energy. If the adapter collar added even a fraction of an ounce of imbalance to the assembly, the vibration forces at operating speed would be severe. Over time, those forces would fatigue the crankshaft, destroy the bearings, crack the adapter plate, and reduce the entire conversion to an expensive pile of scrap. The collar had to be balanced to within a fraction of an ounce, which meant that the machining had to be symmetric to within tenths of a thousandth, and any residual imbalance had to be corrected by removing tiny amounts of material from precisely calculated locations. Gunner had owned a wheel balancer, the kind used for heavy truck tires, that he had modified years ago into a precision dynamic balancing fixture. Marin set up the fixture on a steel stand she welded from angle iron, mounted the flywheel and collar assembly on the balancing arbor, and spun it by hand to operating speed. The dial indicator at the bearing mount registered vibration. Not severe, but present, enough to cause problems over thousands of hours. She marked the heavy spot with a grease pencil. She drilled a small, blind hole in the collar at the heavy point, removing a calculated amount of material. She spun the assembly again, still vibrating but less. She drilled another hole at a different location, smaller calculated, from the residual imbalance vector. She spun it again. The needle barely moved. One more correction, a tenth of an ounce of material removed from a spot she identified as much by feel as by measurement, and the assembly spun clean. The dial indicator needle sat motionless. No vibration, no wobble, balanced. She held her breath during the final check, watched the needle refuse to move. Then she exhaled slowly and stepped back from the fixture. That was the piece that could have killed the project, and it was done. June and July she spent on the supporting systems. Engine mounts fabricated from half-inch plate steel, welded to the farm-all frame rails, with beads so uniform they looked like they had been laid by a machine. Rubber-isolated mounting pads machined from solid rubber blocks designed to absorb the Continental's vibration signature without transmitting it into the frame. Hood modifications cutting and re-welding the sheet metal to clear the diesel engine's taller air cleaner assembly, the cuts and welds so clean that the modification was nearly invisible from 3 feet away. She plumbed a new fuel system, a diesel fuel tank fabricated from sheet steel, a lift pump, dual fuel filters in series primary and secondary because diesel injectors are precision instruments that can be destroyed by a single particle of dirt smaller than a grain of sand. High-pressure injector lines bent from seamless steel tubing and routed along the engine block with custom brackets, each line the same length to ensure equal fuel delivery timing to all 4 cylinders. She rebuilt the cooling system with a larger radiator from a scrapped international truck she found at a yard in Marshfield. The truck had been rear-ended. The cab was destroyed. The radiator was perfect, a heavy-duty 4-row copper brass core with twice the cooling capacity of the Farmall's original unit. She fabricated new mounting brackets, plumbed it into the cooling circuit with custom hoses and a thermostat housing she machined from aluminum bar stock on the lathe. She wired a new electrical system from scratch. Glow plugs for cold starting because a diesel engine does not use spark plugs and needs its combustion chambers preheated in cold weather. A heavy-duty starter motor also from Fort McCoy surplus, capable of cranking the high-compression diesel in January temperatures. A wiring harness she built by hand, soldering every connection with rosin core solder wrapping, every junction and rubber tape routing, every wire through protective loom along the frame rails where heat and abrasion could not reach them. It was August when the mistake happened. She had been working on the project for 3 months. The adapter plate was installed. The engine mounts were welded to the frame. The Continental was sitting in the engine bay, bolted to the plate connected to the Farmall transmission through the flywheel adapter she had balanced with such care. The fuel system was plumbed and bled. The cooling system was connected and filled. The electrical system was wired and tested. The tractor was by every measure she could apply ready to start. She had been eager. That was the problem. After months of careful, painstaking, thousandth by thousandth work, she was close enough to the finish that she could almost hear the engine running, and the almost made her rush. She connected the last of the injector lines on a Saturday evening, double-checked the fuel system for leaks, primed the lift pump until diesel wept from the bleeder valves, and climbed onto the seat. She turned the key. The glow plug light came on. She waited 15 seconds. She pressed the starter button. The Continental turned over. The compression was heavy, the starter straining against the resistance of 4 cylinders squeezing air to ignition temperature. The glow plugs glowed. The injectors fired. The engine coughed once rough and incomplete, coughed again, then caught. For 3 seconds, the workshop filled with the deep, rolling, unmistakable sound of a diesel engine, running the sound Maren had been imagining for months, the sound her father had drawn on paper but never heard. Then the vibration started, not the gentle tremor of an engine at idle, the background hum that every running machine produces. This was something else. A hard, rhythmic shaking that came through the frame rails and into the floor and rattled the wrenches on the pegboard wall 10 feet away. The whole tractor rocked on its tires. The Continental was running, but it was running wrong, and the wrongness was mechanical, structural deep. Maren killed the ignition. The engine sputtered and died. The workshop went silent. The silence that followed was worse than the noise because in the silence, Marin could hear what the vibration meant. Something was misaligned. Something she had built was not right. Something she had spent 3 months of evenings and weekends creating, measuring, checking, and believing in was wrong. She climbed down from the seat and pulled the inspection cover off the bell housing. She mounted a dial indicator on a magnetic base, attaching it to the transmission case, and touched the probe to the adapter plate's pilot bore. Then she rotated the crankshaft by hand, slowly watching the indicator needle. The needle moved. 2 thousandths, then 3. The pilot bore was not concentric with the transmission input shaft. The adapter plate had shifted, but she had checked it. She had measured it 6 times on the bench. It had been perfect. Dead center. Half a thousandth of deviation. She had the measurements in her notebook to prove it. The plate had been perfect on the bench. But when she bolted it to the bell housing under load with the 400-pound weight of the Continental engine hanging on it with the bolts torqued to specification, the plate had moved. The mounting bolts had pulled one side of the plate tighter than the other. The steel had flexed imperceptibly a thousandth of an inch at one edge, and that thousandth had propagated through the rotating assembly, amplified by the spinning mass of the flywheel, until the whole drivetrain was vibrating with a force that would destroy bearings and crack castings within a season. 3 weeks of work on the adapter plate, 3 months of work on the complete installation. One mistake not in the machining, but in the assembly sequence and the torque pattern of the mounting bolts, and the project was a failure. Marin sat down on the shop floor with her back against the Farmall's left rear tire. The concrete was cold. The shop was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to failure. She sat there for a long time. She thought about the real estate man in Wisconsin Rapids. She thought about Lorraine, who would say, "I told you so," without using those exact words, which was worse, because the absence of the words made the meaning louder. She thought about Dale Sievert at the co-op, who would not even need to laugh. He could just raise his eyebrows. In that way, he had that dealer's expression of mild, knowing amusement, and everyone in Adams County would understand what the eyebrows meant. She thought about Gunnar. She wondered if he had ever sat on the same floor in the same posture, facing a failure he could not explain. She wondered if the blueprint on the wall had been the product of a straight line from concept to drawing, or whether Gunnar had made wrong turns on the way to the design, had machine parts that did not work, had sat in this shop and questioned whether the idea was sound. She did not know. She could not ask. That was the nature of inheriting a dead man's project. You got the drawings, but not the drafts. The final answer, but not the working. She sat on the floor until the cold came through her coveralls and made her stand up. Then she covered the Farmall with a canvas tarp, turned off the lights, and went to the house. She did not go back to the shop for 3 days. Walt Dressler came by on a Tuesday. Walt was 71 years old, a retired tool and die maker who had worked at a precision shop in Wausau for 40 years, making injection molds and stamping dies for manufacturers across the Midwest. He had moved back to Adams County after retirement to be near his daughter and her family, and he spent his days the way retired machinists spend their days, reading trade magazines, visiting other shops, and critiquing the work of younger people who did not know what they did not know. He had known Gunnar since 1943, when they met at a war bond drive in Friendship, and discovered within 10 minutes of conversation that they were the only two men in the room who knew what a surface grinder was for. They had been friends for 22 years after that, the quiet kind of friendship that machinists share, built on mutual respect for precision and a mutual inability to explain their work to anyone outside the trade. Walt had heard about Marin's project through the co-op network that connected every person in Adams County to every other person, a grapevine more efficient than any telephone system. He had heard the jokes too. He had not laughed at them. Walt Dressler did not laugh at people who worked with metal, because he knew how hard the work was and how much courage it took to attempt something that had never been done. He drove to the Engstrom farm on a Tuesday afternoon without calling ahead. He found Marin in the yard repairing a fence post, the kind of routine farm task that people do when they are avoiding something else. Walt did not ask if he could see the tractor. He walked into the shop, pulled the tarp off the Farmall, and began examining the work. He moved slowly with his hands behind his back, bending at the waist to look at the engine mounts, the fuel system routing, the cooling modifications, the wiring harness. He crouched down with some difficulty, his knees protesting the way 71-year-old knees protest all sudden requests, and looked at the adapter plate. Then he straightened up and looked at Marin, who had followed him into the shop and was standing by the workbench with her arms crossed and an expression on her face that combined defensiveness and despair in equal measure. "Your plate shifted under bolt load," Walt said. It was not a question. He had seen the dial indicator, still clamped to the transmission case, the probe still touching the pilot bore. He knew what the setup meant. 2 thousandths at the pilot bore, Marin said. Walt nodded slowly. Uneven torque on the mounting bolts. Yes. Walt was quiet for a moment. He looked at the adapter plate. He looked at the blueprint on the wall. He looked at the tools on the pegboard, Gunner's tools, arranged exactly the way Gunner had arranged them. "Your father had the same problem in 57, Walt said. Marin uncrossed her arms. 57. He was building a PTO adapter for the Ford tractor. Same situation exactly. Perfect on the bench. Out of specification under load. He spent 2 weeks trying to understand what happened. It made him furious. You know how he was. Gunner could tolerate a lot of things, but he could not stand a mistake he could not explain." "What did he do?" Marin said. Walt smiled, the brief, contained smile of a man sharing a memory that still pleased him after 20 years. "He did the same thing you were going to do. He pulled the plate. He remachined the bolt holes with a slight interference fit 3 thousandths oversized, so the bolts would preload the plate against shifting when they were torqued. And he torqued them in a star pattern opposite corners, first working inward with a calibrated wrench. So every bolt carried exactly the same load. The interference fit held the plate in position. The star pattern distributed the clamping force evenly. He made a torque sequence diagram and taped it to the wall so he would never make the same mistake twice." Walt paused. "Your father was a great machinist, Marin, but he was great because he made mistakes and figured it out why. The blueprint on that wall is the last page of a long story. The pages before it are full of errors and corrections and problems he solved by refusing to quit. That is what makes a machinist. Not the successes, the recoveries." That was all, Walt said. He did not offer to help with the repair. He did not give advice about anything else. He patted the fender of the farm mall the way a man pats a good horse, a gesture of respect for the machine and the person building it, and walked out of the shop to his truck. Marin watched him drive away. She stood in the doorway of the workshop for a while, feeling the late August sun on her face, feeling something shift inside her that she could not have named, but that felt like her father's hand on her shoulder, steadying her the way he used to steady her hands on the lathe when she was 12, and the cutting tool chattered against the steel. She walked back to the adapter plate. She pulled it off the bell housing that evening. She set it up on the milling machine the next morning. She opened each bolt hole by 3 thousandths of an inch in a carefully calculated pattern that would create an interference fit when the bolts were installed, preloading the plate against lateral movement in any direction. She made a torque sequence diagram on a sheet of paper, numbering each bolt and specifying the order and the torque value, and she taped it to the wall next to her father's blueprint. 2 pieces of paper on the wall now. Gunner's drawing of what the machine should be. Marin's diagram of how to assemble it without the mistake she had made and the mistake her father had made before her. She reinstalled the plate on a Saturday in early September. She torqued each bolt in the sequence she had designed, checking the pilot bore concentricity with the dial indicator after every bolt was tightened. The needle did not move. Not a thousandth. Not half a thousandth. The plate was locked, preloaded, concentric, immovable. She torqued the last bolt and stepped back and looked at the indicator and felt something release in her chest that had been tight since August. The correction took 2 weeks. The lesson lasted forever. Autumn came and went. The corn was harvested, 82 bushels an acre from the sandy ground, not good and not terrible, which was the story of every harvest on the Engstrom farm going back to 1928. Marin sold the crop and put the money in the bank and went back to the shop. She worked through October and November and December. She rebuilt the farm mall's hydraulic pump, which had seized during the years the tractor sat in the fence row. She fabricated a new exhaust manifold from heavy wall steel tubing, routing it beneath the frame to a muffler she adapted from an international truck. She machined an oil filter adapter from aluminum because the Continental took a different filter than the original engine, and no commercial adapter existed. For every problem she made a part. For every mismatch between the Continental diesel and the Farmall frame, she built a bridge. The adapter plate was the largest bridge, but the entire tractor was a collection of bridges, dozens of small fabricated pieces, each one designed and machined to close the gap between two machines that had never been intended to work together. Each one a translation, each one a sentence in the mechanical language her father had taught her to speak. January, February, the coldest months in central Wisconsin, when the temperature dropped below zero for days at a time, and the shop would have been uninhabitable without the wood stove Gunnar had installed in the corner. Marin fed the stove with oak splits she had cut and stacked the previous autumn. The shop temperature climbed to maybe 45 degrees on the coldest nights, which was warm enough to work if you wore insulated coveralls and fingerless gloves. You could not feel a micrometer through thick gloves, and in machining feel was everything. The difference between a good cut and a bad cut was often something you sensed through your fingertips before you saw it on the dial. 5 months, every night after chores, every weekend, every hour she could steal from the demands of a working farm. Alone in the workshop with Fritz's tools and Fritz's blueprint, and the sound of the milling machine cutting steel in the cold Wisconsin darkness outside the windows. On a Saturday morning in March of 1968, Maren Engstrom rolled the Farmall Super M out of the workshop under its own power for the first time. She had connected the last of the glow plug wiring the night before. She had filled the cooling system with a mixture of water and ethylene glycol formulated for the Wisconsin climate. She had bled the fuel system, cracking each injector, line fitting and cranking the engine until diesel seeped from every connection, then tightening each one in sequence. She had checked the oil level, the belt tensions, the battery connections, the coolant hoses, the fuel filter, housings. She had gone through a checklist she had written herself, 47 items long, each one verified with a pencil check mark on a sheet of notebook paper. She climbed onto the seat. The steel was cold through her coveralls. The morning air was 5 degrees above zero, cold enough that her breath made thick clouds in the early light. Frost covered the fields in every direction, white and crystalline, turning the sandy Adams County landscape into something almost beautiful. She turned the key. The glow plug indicator light came on, a small amber glow on the dashboard that meant the heating elements in the combustion chambers were warming, preparing the air inside the cylinders for the compression ignition that would follow. She waited 15 seconds. The light went out. She pressed the starter button. The Continental turned over. The starter motor strained against the compression of 4 cylinders, each one squeezing air to over 500 degrees. Once, the engine rocked on its mounts. Twice, she could feel the compression pulses through the seat, through the frame, through the steel bones of the machine. On the third revolution, the number 1 cylinder fired. The sound was a deep percussive thud, more felt than heard, a shockwave that traveled through the frame and into the ground. Then number 3 fired, then 2 and 4 together, and the engine caught and settled into an idle that was deeper, smoother, and more authoritative than any Farmall Super M had ever produced from the Harvester factory in Rock Island, Illinois. The exhaust note was wrong for a Farmall, wrong in a way that anyone who had ever heard a Farmall would recognize instantly. Too deep, too slow, too diesel. The original gas engine had a higher pitch, a lighter quality, the sound of spark ignition and moderate compression. The Continental sounded like something from a different world, a military world, a world of generators and air compressors and industrial equipment built to run 24 hours a day without complaint. A military growl coming from a farm tractor hood. It sounded like a tank had been crossed with a corn picker. It sounded like nothing Adams County had ever heard. The frame hummed with a frequency that was new, lower than gasoline, steadier, more purposeful. The rubber-isolated engine mounts absorbed the diesel's vibration pulses and converted them into a gentle tremor that you could feel through the seat, but that did not rattle or shake. The adapter plate held true. The flywheel balanced clean. Everything she had built over 5 months of winter work was functioning exactly the way she had designed it. Maren sat on the cold seat and listened. She listened to the engine idle for a full minute, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her eyes closed, hearing every beat of the 4 cylinders, feeling every pulse through the frame, checking by sound and touch for any irregularity, any roughness, any hint of the problems she had spent 2 weeks correcting in September. There was nothing wrong. The engine ran smooth. The oil pressure gauge read 40 pounds. The temperature gauge was climbing slowly from cold toward operating range. The ammeter showed the generator charging. Every system was working. Every bridge she had built between the Continental and the Farmall was holding. She opened her eyes, she put the Farmall in gear, she released the clutch. She drove it across the yard and out to the south field, the field that faced the road, the field that every neighbor driving past could see. She hooked up a four-bottom plow. The original Farmall Super M with its factory gasoline engine making 44 horsepower could pull a three-bottom plow through the sandy Adams County ground without lugging down. Three bottoms was the practical limit. Every farmer in the county knew it. You could hook up a fourth bottom, but the engine would labor and slow and overheat, and you would spend more time nursing the tractor than plowing the field. Marin dropped the fourth bottom into the soil, settled into the seat, and opened the throttle. The Continental diesel pulled all four plows through the sand like it was running downhill. The engine did not strain. The RPM did not drop. The exhaust note deepened slightly under load the way a diesel's note deepens when it is working, but there was no labor in it, no struggle. The torque curve of the CD193, broad and flat and relentless across the entire operating range, put power to the ground at exactly the speed and force the soil required. The sandy ground that grabbed at plow bottoms and bogged down gas engines was no match for the diesel's low-end torque. The twisting force that Continental had designed into the engine for industrial applications, where loads were constant and heavy, and mercy was not expected. More torque, more power, cheaper fuel. $120 of surplus and scrap, pulling a four-bottom plow through ground that had defeated three-bottom rigs for as long as anyone could remember. The neighbors noticed. You could not miss it. Sound travels far across Wisconsin farmland in March when the air is cold and dense, and there are no leaves on the trees to absorb it. The diesel note of the Continental carried across the flat fields for half a mile or more, and it was different enough from every other engine in the county that farmers on neighboring properties stopped what they were doing and listened. Men who had laughed at the engineless Farmall in April of '67 were standing at their fence lines in March of '68, coffee cups cooling in their hands, watching Marin Engstrom pull a four-bottom plow across her south field, watching the furrows turn clean and straight behind the machine, hearing the diesel rumble where a gas engine should have been, counting the plow bottoms and arriving at four, which was one more than should have been possible. The jokes stopped, not all at once because jokes have momentum and habits of speech are hard to break. But the tone shifted. The laughter became quieter, then curious, then silent, then replaced by something else entirely. A grudging recognition that the woman with the tin can had known something they did not. Dale Siebert heard about it at the co-op the following week. 5 different farmers told him the same story, each one adding a detail the previous teller had omitted, each one a little more impressed than the last. The Engstrom girl put a diesel in that Farmall. Military surplus engine, Continental. Thing sounds like a tank and pulls like a caterpillar. She was running a four-bottom Saturday morning like it was nothing. Dale drove out to the Engstrom farm on a Saturday. He found Marin in the yard changing the oil in the Farmall. She had machined an oil filter adapter from aluminum bar stock because the Continental took a different filter cartridge than the original engine, and she was installing a new filter element when Dale's truck pulled into the drive. He did not announce himself. He walked to the tractor and started looking. The hood was up. The Continental sat in the Farmall's engine bay, painted the same red as the Farmall sheet metal, looking almost like it belonged there. Almost. The proportions were slightly different. The diesel was a little taller, a little narrower than the gas engine it replaced. The air cleaner sat higher. The injector lines caught the light at angles that were unfamiliar. But the installation was clean, professional. The fuel lines ran in neat parallel curves along the block. The wiring harness was bundled and loomed with military precision. The engine mounts were welded to the frame with beads so uniform they looked like they had been applied by a robot. Dale crouched down and looked at the underside of the tractor. He saw the adapter plate. He saw the engine mount isolation pads. He saw the exhaust routing the cooling system modifications, the custom thermostat housing. He spent 15 minutes under the Farmall, crawling on the gravel, examining every weld, every fitting, every fabricated bracket, every piece of the conversion that was visible from below. When he stood up, brushing gravel from his knees, his expression had changed. Marin had seen many expressions on Dale Sievert's face over the years. Amusement was common. Condescension was not rare. The practiced, calibrated concern of a salesman who wanted you to feel that your current equipment was just slightly inadequate, just barely insufficient, just enough below the standard to justify a visit to his lot and a conversation about financing. She had never seen what she saw in his face now. She did not have a word for it, but it felt like the space between surprise and respect. "This is factory quality work," Dale said. He said it slowly, the way a man speaks when he is revising a belief he has held for a long time. "Better than factory. The tolerances on that adapter plate, the way you balance the flywheel assembly, the mount isolation. This is professional engineering. My father taught me. Your father was a machinist, best in Adams County, maybe best in central Wisconsin. I knew that. I should have remembered it before I called your tractor a tin can." They stood in the yard for a long time talking. Dale asked questions that revealed more mechanical knowledge than Marin had expected from a salesman. How much power? 58 at the drawbar, she estimated, based on the pull she was getting with the four-bottom plow and the engine speed under load. Factory spec was 48, but the Army underrated everything, and Gunner had been right about the real output. More power, cheaper fuel, diesel at 22 cents a gallon instead of gasoline at 35. Longer engine life because diesel engines run at lower RPM and higher compression, which means less wear per hour of operation. And the total cost, Dale said. He knew it would be low. He did not know how low. 35 for the tractor, 85 for the engine, maybe 40 in steel gaskets, hoses, and hardware. Call it $160. The number sat in the air between them like a physical object. Dale Sievert sold John Deere tractors for a living. He had been selling them for 12 years. The cheapest machine on his lot that spring was a John Deere 4020 priced at $7,400. He was standing in a farmyard looking at a tractor that outperformed half his inventory for $160, built by a 29-year-old woman, in a barn. From an engine the Army threw away and a frame the auctioneer almost did not bother to list. "I am not going to sell you a John Deere," Dale said. "Am I?" "Probably not." "No, probably not." Dale drove home. He told nobody about the visit. Not his wife, not the men at the parts counter, not the other dealers in the regional association. For the first time in his career, Dale Sievert had encountered something that his profession could not accommodate, and he needed time to process what it meant. The diesel Super M became the center of Marin Engstrom's farming operation from '68 onward, and it never relinquished the position. The Continental engine started every morning, winter and summer, with the reliability of a machine that had been designed for military service and built to tolerances that civilian equipment rarely matched. In January, at 20 below zero, when gas engines sat cold and dead and would not turn over because the gasoline had lost its volatility and the oil had thickened to sludge, the Continental's glow plugs heated the combustion chambers. The diesel fuel atomized under injection pressure, regardless of temperature, and the engine fired on the second or third crank and settled into its deep, steady idle as if the cold were an irrelevance. It burned a third less fuel than the gasoline tractors on neighboring farms. It pulled harder at low RPM. It ran cooler in summer because the diesel combustion cycle is more thermodynamically efficient than the gasoline cycle. It required nothing more than oil changes every 200 hours, filter replacements, and an annual check of the injector timing. The adapter plate held. The flywheel adapter stayed balanced. The engine mounts did not crack. Everything Marin had built during the winter of '67 to '68 was holding because everything had been built by a machinist who understood that holding was not a hope but a specification. By 1975, the Continental had logged over 4,000 hours without a single major repair. 4,000 hours of plowing and cultivating and planting and hauling and every other demand a working farm places on a tractor. The $160 machine was outworking equipment that had cost 50 times as much and was already wearing out. And Marin kept building. That was the thing about her, the thing that separated her from a person who gets lucky once. The Super M was not a one-time project. It was a philosophy made physical. It was her father's philosophy, the idea that a machine is never a finished product but a starting point. The idea that anything can be reimagined if you understand the systems well enough to see what they could become. Over the next decade, she built 3 more diesel conversions for other farmers in the region. Each one was different because each farmer had different needs, and each tractor frame presented different challenges. A Farmall H with a small Perkins 4-cylinder diesel for a neighbor who farmed 60 acres and needed a light fuel-efficient machine for hay work in garden cultivation. A Farmall 560 with a turbocharged Continental for a farmer 20 miles north who worked heavy clay soil and needed more power than any stock engine could provide. A Farmall 460 with a surplus Navy generator diesel for a dairyman outside of Coloma who needed a tractor that would start without fail on January mornings because a dairyman who cannot start his tractor at 5 a.m. cannot feed his cows, and cows do not wait for machinery problems to resolve. She charged $200 to $400 for each conversion, parts, and a modest labor fee. The farmer supplied the tractor frames. Marin sourced the engines from military surplus sales, industrial auctions, and scrap yards across Wisconsin and Minnesota. Every adapter plate was custom machined on Gunner's Bridgeport. Every installation was one of a kind, and every single one of them ran. Dale Sievert watched his potential customer base shrink one diesel conversion at a time. Farmers who might have bought a used John Deere from his lot were instead paying Marin $300 for a machine that worked as well or better. But Dale was a better man than the jokes about car dealers would suggest. He could see the quality. He knew that the work coming out of the Engstrom shop was not backyard tinkering, but professional-grade mechanical engineering, and he knew that fighting it, bad-mouthing it, trying to convince farmers that Marin's conversions were unsafe or unreliable would be both dishonest and futile. The machines spoke for themselves. They started in the cold. They pulled in the sand. They lasted. In 1976, Dale did something that surprised everyone in Adams County, including himself. He started sending customers to Marin, farmers who walked into his dealership looking for a used tractor on a tight budget, men who could not afford a new John Deere and did not want to mortgage their land to finance one. Dale would listen to their situation, consider their acreage and their soil type and their operating costs, and then say something that no tractor dealer in the state of Wisconsin had probably ever said before. I cannot help you for under $3,000. But there is a woman south of Friendship who can. Name is Marin Engstrom. She will build you a tractor from surplus parts for a fraction of what I would charge. And honestly, it will run better than most of what is on my lot. It was an unusual arrangement, a dealer sending customers to someone who was, in effect, a competitor. But Dale understood a principle that many salesmen never learn and that the best salesmen never forget. A farmer you help, even by sending him to someone else, is a farmer who remembers your name. And when that farmer's situation improves, when the crop prices rise, or the debt is paid off, or the inheritance comes through, he walks into your dealership first, because you were the one who helped him when he could not afford to be helped. Marin's savings grew the way quiet savings always grow when expenses are low and the work never stops. The $160 tractor had no monthly payment. The land was paid for. The workshop was paid for. She grew corn and soybeans on the sandy 140 acres, 80 to 90 bushels of corn in the good years, 65 to 70 in the lean ones. Nothing spectacular, but with near zero overhead, with no equipment, debt, no land payment, no shop mortgage, every bushel was profit. She put away $6,000 to $8,000 a year through the 1970s. Not in the stock market, not in speculative investments, in a savings account at the Adams County Farmers Bank, where the interest rate was modest and the principal was safe. The money accumulated the way snowfall accumulates in a Wisconsin winter, silently, steadily, one layer on top of another until the depth is surprising. By 1982, Marin Engstrom had $78,000 in the bank. The diesel conversion business had added another $15,000 to $20,000 over the years. Every dollar earned the same way. Surplus parts, skilled hands, her father's tools, patient, invisible accumulation, while the rest of the county spent faster than it earned. She did not know that the farm crisis was coming. Nobody did. But when it arrived, Marin Engstrom was the only farmer in Adams County who did not feel it. The crisis arrived the way winter arrives in Wisconsin. You could see it coming for months. The signs were in the newspapers, in the interest rate announcements from the Federal Reserve and the falling commodity prices that every farmer tracked the way a sailor tracks the barometer. But seeing it coming and being able to stop it were different things. You cannot stop a winter. You can only prepare for one. Interest rates climbed past 15% in 1980, then 16, 17, 18. The Federal Reserve, fighting the inflation that had plagued the American economy for a decade, tightened the money supply until credit became so expensive that borrowing felt like bleeding. Every farmer in the Midwest who carried debt felt the pressure increase with each rate announcement. Each fraction of a point added to the cost of the money they owed. Corn prices dropped in parallel, $3 a bushel in 80, $2.50 in 81, under $2 Hamos by 83. The math that had made sense during the boom years of the 70s, when a man could borrow at 8% to buy land that was appreciating at 12, reversed itself. The man who had borrowed to expand was now paying 18% on a loan secured by land that was losing value. The tractor he had financed was depreciating faster than he could pay it off. The operating line of credit that had been routine was now ruinous. Adams County lost 6 farms between 1982 and 1986, each one a variation on the same theme: expansion during the boom, confidence that prices would keep rising and land would keep appreciating and credit would remain cheap. Then the reversal, the phone call from the bank, the meeting in the office with the loan officer who used to smile and now could not make eye contact. The auction. Dale Sievert watched from behind the counter of his John Deere dealership as his world contracted. Sales dropped by half, then by half again. Farmers were not buying new equipment. They were trying to keep what they had. Some were returning machines they could no longer make payments on. Dale took back 3 tractors in 83, each one worth less on his lot than the remaining balance on the loan, and he ate the difference because the alternative was suing farmers who had nothing left to take. The crisis was a correction, the economists said, a market adjustment, a return to fundamentals. The words sounded clean in textbooks. On the ground in Adams County, the correction looked like auction signs on every third road and moving trucks in driveways where families had lived for generations. Maren Engstrom's costs did not change. They never changed. That was the structural advantage of building instead of buying, of surplus instead of new, of cash instead of credit. The Continental diesel burned 22-cent fuel and asked for nothing but oil. The land owed nothing to any bank. The shop owed nothing. The equipment owed nothing. When corn dropped to $1.75, Maren adjusted. She cut her personal spending, which was already minimal. She deferred a paint job on the barn. She skipped the county fair. But she kept farming, and she kept saving. Less than before, 3 or 4,000 a year instead of 7 or 8, but the direction never changed. Forward, accumulating. While the rest of Adams County was hemorrhaging cash, Maren Engstrom was still putting money in the bank. Boyd Krieger farmed the 180 acres directly east of Maren's property. Boyd was a good man. That is the simplest and most accurate thing that can be said about him. He was the kind of neighbor who showed up without being asked when there was work to be done, the kind who noticed when a fence was down or a field was too wet to plant and adjusted his own schedule to help without making a production of the helping. He did not talk much. He worked steadily. He treated his land and his animals and his family with the same quiet, consistent care. He had helped Maren in the winter of age 65 after Gunnar died when she was 27 and alone on 140 acres, and the east fence line needed repair before the snow came. The fence posts were frozen into the ground. Maren did not own a sledgehammer heavy enough to drive new ones in the frozen soil. Boyd drove over one afternoon with a 12-pound sledge and a post driver and spent 4 hours in the cold, pounding cedar posts into ground that did not want to accept them. And when he was done, he nodded at Maren and drove home without saying much beyond good night. Maren remembered that afternoon for the rest of her life. Not because the fence mattered, though it did, because the gesture mattered. Because in the months after Gunnar's death, when the world felt empty and the farm felt pointless, and Lorraine was pressing her to sell, Boyd Krieger had shown up with a sledgehammer and demonstrated without a word of philosophy that neighbors still existed and that she was not entirely alone. Boyd had expanded in 1978. He borrowed from the Adams County Farmers Bank to buy an additional 60 acres north of his existing property, and he financed a new John Deere 440 from Dale Sievert's lot for $28,000. Both decisions made sense at the time. Corn was $3.50. Credit was available at reasonable rates. The farm economy was strong. Every advisor, every extension agent, every banker was telling farmers to grow. Expand your acreage, modernize your equipment, increase your capacity. The future was demand, and demand meant opportunity. By 1983, the 60 acres were worth $350 an acre instead of the 800 Boyd had paid. The John Deere was worth maybe $12,000 on a good day instead of 28, and the interest on both loans had climbed to 18%, which meant Boyd was paying annual interest that exceeded his annual crop revenue. He was farming to pay the bank, and the bank was still not satisfied. He went to the bank 3 times in 2 years. Each visit was worse than the last. The first time, the loan officer restructured the payment schedule and told Boyd that things would improve. The second time, a different loan officer younger told Boyd that the bank needed to see a plan for bringing the accounts current. The third time, in the spring of '84, the original loan officer was back, and his face had the expression of a man delivering news he did not want to deliver. The bank was done extending. Adams County Farmers Bank was carrying too many troubled agricultural loans. The examiners were asking questions. The board was nervous. Boyd had until the end of harvest to bring both accounts current, or the bank would foreclose on the collateral and sell everything at auction. Boyd could not bring the accounts current. Not at those prices. Not at those interest rates. Not with the corn coming in at $1.75 and the cost running at $2.10 per bushel. It was arithmetic, not moral failure. But arithmetic does not distinguish between bad luck and bad character, and neither in the end do banks. The auction was held on a Saturday in October of 1984. It was one of those Wisconsin autumn days that arrives like an apology for the winter, that is coming clear and bright, and 55 degrees, the trees along the fence rows turning gold and scarlet, the sky a blue so deep it hurt to look at. A beautiful day for anything except what was about to happen. The auctioneer set up his podium in front of the Krieger machine shed. The crowd was larger than most farm auctions because the Krieger place was known to be good land productive, despite the sandy soil, and the people who attend auctions during a farm crisis are a mixed lot. Neighbors who come out of solidarity and guilt. Equipment dealers who come for bargains. Speculators from the cities Milwaukee and Madison who come with calculators and cold eyes looking for land they can buy cheap and rent back to the very farmers who lost it. Boyd stood near the machine shed with his wife Eleanor and their 2 teenage sons. He was wearing a clean shirt and a face that Marin recognized because she had seen it on her own face in the mirror during the months after Gunnar died. The face of a person who has done everything within their power and knows it was not enough. Marin arrived early. She parked on the county road and walked in through the crowd without stopping to talk to anyone. She found a spot at the edge of the gathering near the east fence where she could see the auctioneer's podium without being conspicuous. She was wearing the canvas jacket. The checkbook from the Adams County Farmers Bank, was in the inside pocket. The equipment sold first. The John Deere 4440 went for $14,000. Boyd had paid $28. A disc harrow brought $400. A planter brought $600. A grain cart $900. The pieces of a working farm separated and scattered sold to the highest bidders, carried away on flatbed trucks. Each piece a part of Boyd's life that he would not see again. Then the land. The 60-acre parcel, the one Boyd had borrowed to buy in '78, sold first. A speculator from Milwaukee bought it for $280 an acre. Quick sale, no drama. Boyd watched it go with the expression of a man who had already grieved that piece and moved on to the larger grief waiting behind it. The original 180 acres came last. The home place. The land Boyd's grandfather had cleared from brush and oak in the 1930s. The land Boyd's father had farmed through the Depression and the war and the recovery. The land Boyd had expected to hand to his sons the way it had been handed to him, a piece of the earth that belonged to a family the way a name belongs by inheritance and by right. The bank set the opening bid at $200 an acre. The auctioneer called for bids. A speculator from Milwaukee, the same one who had bought the 60 acres, raised his hand. 200. 240, said a voice from the east fence. Every head in the crowd turned. Marin Engstrom, standing by the fence in her father's canvas jacket with one hand raised. The speculator consulted with his partner. They ran numbers on a calculator. 260, 280, Marin said. The speculator ran more numbers. 300. 310, Marin said. Her voice was steady. She did not hesitate. The speculator looked at his partner. His partner shook his head. At $310 an acre, the projected return on Sandy Adams County farmland rented at current market rates did not justify the capital outlay for an investment group based in Milwaukee. The speculator dropped his hand. $310, 180 acres, $55,800. The auctioneer asked for the payment method. Marin walked from the fence to the auctioneer's table. She took the checkbook from the inside pocket of the jacket. She opened it to the next blank check. She wrote the date. She wrote the amount. $55,800. She signed her name. She tore the check from the book and laid it on the table. Cash. One check. No financing. No partners. No bank loan. One woman, one signature, one farm. The crowd went quiet. There is a particular silence that falls over an auction crowd when money speaks louder than anyone expected. It is not the silence of shock exactly, though shock is part of it. It is the silence of recalculation, the collective revision of every assumption the crowd had carried into the event. The woman with the junk tractor, the woman with the surplus engine, the woman on the sandy 140 acres that everyone said should have been sold years ago. She was writing a check for $55,000 while the men who had bought John Deere's on credit and abandoned with borrowed money were standing on the other side of the podium watching their own land disappear. Boyd Krieger saw who had bought his farm. He stood still for a long moment. Then he walked toward Marin slowly the way a man walks when his legs are not entirely reliable and his emotions are moving faster than his body can manage. Eleanor followed a few steps behind, holding the arm of their older son. Marin met Boyd halfway between the podium and the fence. They stood in the October sunlight, two farmers, one who had just lost 180 acres and one who had just bought them. Boyd's face was doing things that faces do when too many feelings arrive at the same time. Gratitude that the land had gone to a neighbor and not a city speculator. Shame that he had lost it at all. Relief, grief, something else underneath it all that was harder to identify, something that had to do with the specific pain of being helped by someone you once would have expected to help. Marin spoke first. She spoke the way she did everything, directly, without decoration, without the preliminary circling that most people use to approach difficult subjects. Boyd, I want you to keep working this land. Boyd stared at her. He opened his mouth and closed it. I do not need 180 more acres to manage by myself, Marin said. I need someone who knows this ground. You know it better than anyone alive. Your grandfather cleared it. Your father worked it. You have been on it your whole life. I want you to stay on as a partner. Not a hired man, a partner. You manage the fields. We split the crop at harvest. Your family stays in the house. Boyd's eyes were wet. He was a man of his generation, raised to believe that tears were private, and the effort of holding them back was visible in the muscles of his jaw and the set of his shoulders. Eleanor stepped forward and put her hand on Boyd's arm. She looked at Marin with an expression that contained more gratitude than words could carry. Boyd took Marin's hand and shook it. His grip was strong and calloused and unsteady. Your father would have done the same thing, Boyd said. His voice was rough. I know, Marin said. That is why I am doing it. Dale Sievert was at the auction. He had been standing near the machine shed watching the equipment sell, counting the losses in his head, the way dealers do during a crisis, calculating the gap between what he had financed and what the machines brought at sale. When Marin's name was announced as the buyer of the Krieger home place, Dale walked across the yard to the fence. $55,000 in cash, Dale said. He looked at Marin with the expression of a man who has been watching a story unfold for 17 years and has only now understood its ending. From the woman who builds tractors out of army surplus and scrap frames. That is right. Dale took off his cap and rubbed his forehead. It was a gesture Marin had seen him make before, but this time it meant something different. It was not the gesture of a man buying time to frame a sales pitch. It was the gesture of a man rearranging his understanding of the world. I have been selling John Deere's for 20 years, Dale said. Selling progress, selling horsepower, selling the future of American agriculture. That is what the brochures say, the future. And the woman who showed up at an auction in '67 with a $35 engineless Farmall is the one buying land, while my customers are the ones selling it. Your customers bought on credit, Marin said. I built from scrap. There is a difference. The difference is about $55,000 and zero monthly payments. That is one way to measure it. Dale was quiet for a long moment. The auction crowd was dispersing. Trucks were pulling out of the lot. The afternoon light was turning golden as the sun moved west. I owe you an apology, Dale said. I laughed at that farm all in '67, called it a tin can, told everybody at the co-op you were wasting money on junk. Told them worse than that if I am being honest. I said things about a woman running a machine shop alone that I am not proud of now and was not proud of then, if I am being completely honest, which at my age is the only kind of honest worth being. You sent me customers in '76, Marin said. I remember that. The least I could do. By '75, I knew the quality of your work was better than anything coming off my lot. Took me a few years to admit it out loud. But I knew it. Your adapter plate work, your welding, your whole approach. It was beyond what the factories were doing. And you learned it from Gunnar. Yes, Gunnar was the best machinist I ever met. And I have been around machinery my whole life. They shook hands. The dealer and the builder. The man who sold new machines and the woman who made impossible ones. Two people who had started on opposite sides of a gulf and found after 17 years of watching each other across the distance that the gulf was narrower than either had believed. Marin farmed the combined 320 acres from 1984 onward. Boyd Krieger managed the east 180. The partnership worked because both parties were honest and because both understood the land and what it demanded. Boyd knew every contour of the Krieger fields, every low spot that held water, every sandy ridge that dried out first, every corner where the soil changed character and the planting approach had to adjust. Marin maintained the equipment and kept the books and made the decisions about capital expenditure, which meant in practice that she decided what to build next. Boyd's sons helped during planting and harvest. The Krieger family stayed in their house on the land that had been theirs and now belonged to Marin, but still felt like theirs because Marin never once treated the arrangement as anything other than what it was, a partnership between neighbors, a continuation of what had been. The diesel Super M ran through the late '80s and into the '90s with the same dependable constancy it had maintained since March of '68. By 1990, the Continental had logged over 12,000 hours. 12,000 hours of turning soil and pulling loads and performing every task that a farm tractor performs across a quarter century of seasons. The adapter plate that had given Marin such grief in '67, the piece she had remachined with the interference fit in the torque sequence diagram, had not shifted a thousandth of an inch in 22 years. The flywheel adapter was still balanced. The engine mounts had not cracked. The fuel system was tight. The cooling system functioned. Every bridge she had built between the Continental diesel and the Farmall frame was intact because every bridge had been built to tolerances that anticipated decades, not seasons. In 1994, Marin was 56. Her son Eli was 24. He had grown up in Gunnar's workshop the way Marin had grown up in it, learning the lathe from the time his hands were large enough to grip the cross-slide handle. He had his grandfather's aptitude for metal and his mother's patience with the measuring instruments. He understood machines the way the Engstrom family had always understood them, not as products to be purchased, but as systems to be imagined and built and improved. Marin handed the farming operation to Eli that spring. Not because she was unable to continue. Her hands were steady, her mind was sharp. The work was still in her. But she understood the way Gunnar had understood that knowledge must be passed or it dies. The workshop and the tools and the skills they represented were not possessions to be hoarded. They were a current to be carried forward. Eli was ready. The farm was ready. The transfer was as natural as the changing of a season. In the summer of 1998, the Adams County Historical Society contacted Marin about displaying the diesel Farmall Super M at the county fair. Marin agreed. She had one condition. The display had to include a sign explaining the KM. The sign was made of painted plywood 3 feet by 4 feet with lettering done by a sign painter from Adams who still practiced the trade by hand. It read 1952, Farmall Super M diesel conversion, tractor frame $35, Continental C D193 diesel engine military surplus $85, adapter plate mounts hardware $40, total cost $160, hours logged 18,000 plus, performance 58 horsepower 4-bottom plow capacity. Status still in daily farm use. Below that in smaller lettering, built by Maren Engstrom in her father's workshop, winter 1967 to 68. Gunnar Engstrom, master machinist, 1903 to 1965. Maren stood by the display all day. She stood the way she did everything quietly without seeking attention, without narrating the story to every passerby. The tractor told its own story. The numbers on the sign told another. People approached, read the sign, looked at the tractor, and either walked on or stayed. The ones who stayed were mostly older men, farmers in their 60s and 70s who had lived through the era the tractor represented. Men who remembered the surplus sales at Fort McCoy and the farm crisis of the 80s and the auctions that had claimed their neighbors' land. They stood in front of the display and looked at the numbers and ran the calculations in their heads and said very little because the calculations did not require commentary. $160, 18,000 hours, still running. The numbers were their own argument. Some of these men remembered the jokes from '67. They remembered laughing. They remembered the story about the Engstrom girl in the tin can with no engine. They stood in front of the tractor now 31 years later, and the laughter was a long way away. Dale Sivert came by in the afternoon. He was 72 years old. He had retired from the dealership in 1990, selling the business to a younger man who sold John Deeres and Kubotas and would eventually sell the lot itself to a developer who turned it into a gas station and convenience store. Dale walked with a cane because his right knee had finally surrendered to 5 decades of climbing on and off tractor steps and crawling under machines on showroom floors. His hair was white. His hands were spotted with age. But his grip when he shook Maren's hand was still firm. He stood in front of the sign for a long time, reading the numbers, adding them up, dividing them by the years of service, calculating the cost per hour of operation, which was a number so small it was almost imaginary. $160, Dale said. $160, Maren confirmed. I sold 4020s for $7,400, 4440s for $28,000, 6460s for $45,000. And this thing, this $160 collection of surplus and scrap and machine steel, it outlasted, outworked, and outperformed every single one of them. Not outperformed, Maren said. Your John Deeres were fine machines, well-engineered, well-built. I never said they were bad machines. Dale looked at her. I just did not need them, Maren said. Dale was quiet. He looked at the tractor. He looked at the sign. He looked out at the county fair crowd, the families and the farmers and the children eating cotton candy, the whole community moving through the August heat in the particular way that small-town communities move at their fairs slowly and together. Nobody needed them, Dale said. His voice was thoughtful, not bitter, reflective. The voice of a man who has spent 8 years of retirement thinking about the career that preceded it. Nobody needed the horsepower I was selling. Not really. Not the way I told them they needed it. They needed what you were building. Enough machine to do the job. Paid for in cash. Running on cheap fuel. Built to last a lifetime. That is what farming actually requires. Everything else is just... He moved his hand through the air, a gesture that encompassed the new equipment on display in the exhibition hall, the advertisements on the banners, the entire apparatus of agricultural commerce that he had spent his career serving. Decoration, Dale said. Maren smiled. It was a quiet smile, the kind that does not need witnesses or applause, the kind that comes from a place inside a person that is satisfied not because they have won something, but because the world has finally confirmed what they already knew. My father used to say that a factory builds what it can sell, Maren said. A machinist builds what she needs. Your father was right. He usually was. They stood together by the display for a while, the retired dealer and the builder, two people who had known each other for 31 years and had only recently arrived at an understanding that should have been obvious from the beginning. Then a woman appeared at the edge of the display area. She was small and white-haired, 81 years old, moving carefully with the deliberate steps of someone whose balance was no longer automatic. She had been driven to the fair by her sister from Wisconsin Rapids, a drive of 45 minutes that she would not have been able to make alone. Lorraine Engstrom had not been to the Adams County Fair in 6 years. She had not been to the Engstrom farm in 3. The distance between her and her daughter was not geographical. It was the accumulated weight of 33 years of disagreement, about what a life should look like, what a woman should do with a farm and a workshop and a set of machinist's tools that had belonged to a dead man who had loved metal more than he loved moderation. Marin had not known her mother was coming. She saw Lorraine at the edge of the display and felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in a long time. Something that was part surprise and part fear and part a hope she had stopped acknowledging. Years ago, Lorraine walked slowly to the farm mall. She put her hand on the frame rail, the same spot where Marin had placed her hand 31 years earlier at the Kirchner auction. The spot where you could feel the weight and the balance and the solidity of the machine that International Harvester's engineers had built in 1952 and that Marin Engstrom had reimagined in 1967. Lorraine looked at the engine under the open hood. She would not have known a Continental CD-193 from any other engine. She had never understood the machines or the shop or the hours Gunnar spent there or the hours Marin continued to spend there after Gunnar was gone. She had understood only that the shop took her husband and then took her daughter, and that the taking had felt to her like a kind of loss that no precision could compensate. She looked at the sign. She read the numbers. She read the words at the bottom. Gunnar Engstrom, Master Machinist, 1903 to 1965. She stood there. The fair crowd moved around her like water around a stone. Dale Sievert stepped quietly back, understanding, without being told that this moment was not his. When Lorraine spoke, her voice was thin and steady, the voice of a woman who had been carrying something for a very long time and was about to set it down. Your father would be so proud of you, Marin. 6 words. In 33 years since Gunnar's death, through the arguments about selling the farm, through the long silences, through the phone calls that always ended the same way, through the years of loving each other across a gap, neither of them knew how to close. Lorraine had never said those words. She had never acknowledged that Marin's choice to stay on the farm and build in the shop and live by Gunnar's philosophy was anything other than a mistake, a stubbornness, a grief that had hardened into habit. Now she was saying it, standing in front of the machine that proved it. Marin put her arm around her mother's shoulders. Lorraine leaned into her daughter the way people lean into something solid when they are tired of standing alone. They stood together in front of the tractor that Gunnar Engstrom had imagined but never built. The tractor his daughter had constructed from his blueprint in his workshop with his tools during a winter so cold the metal stung her hands. The tractor that had plowed and hauled and endured for 30 years on an adapter plate, machined by a woman who was 29 and alone and determined to finish what her father had started. For a moment, the three of them were together. The machinist who had drawn the blueprint, the wife who had loved him without understanding him, the daughter who had understood him completely and built the proof. I know, Mama, Marin said. I know he would be. Eli Engstrom farms the 320 acres now. Boyd Krager's sons work alongside him, the partnership their mother arranged in '84 still functioning 30 years later, held together by the same forces that hold all good arrangements together. Honesty, shared work, the memory of a handshake in an auction yard on an October afternoon. Eli's son is 16. He is learning to run the lathe. He comes to the workshop after school and on weekends, the way Marin came to it as a child, the way children are drawn to places where adults do real work with real tools on real materials. He is learning to read a micrometer. He is learning to hear the sound a lathe makes when the cut is right. He is learning that a thousandth of an inch is not an abstraction, but a physical reality, something you can feel under your fingertips, something that matters. 3 generations of Engstrom machinists, each one building what the factory would not, each one fixing what the dealers could not, each one carrying forward the knowledge that Gunnar brought from Stuttgart in 1928, the knowledge that metal can be shaped by anyone who is willing to learn how, and that the machines of the world are not finished products, but starting points for anyone with the skill and the patience and the courage to reimagine them. The Continental CD-193 diesel has logged over 18,000 hours on Marin's adapter plate. 18,000 hours of service from an engine the Army declared surplus and a frame the auctioneer almost did not bother to list. The engine starts on the 2nd or 3rd crank winter, and summer the same dependable growl it has produced since March of 1968. The adapter plate has not shifted. The flywheel adapter is still balanced. The engine mounts have not cracked. Gunnar's workshop is still standing. The lathe still runs true. The Bridgeport still cuts to 1,000th. The blueprint is still pinned to the wall above the milling machine, Gunner's precise mechanical pencil, lines still legible after 3 decades, the dimensions still accurate, the vision still clear. Next to the blueprint taped to the same wall is the torque sequence diagram Marin made in September of '67 after the adapter plate shifted and the project nearly failed. 2 pieces of paper, side by side, one from the father who designed the machine, one from the daughter who built it and fixed it and drove it for 30 years. The factory builds what it can sell. The machinist builds what she needs. $160, an Army engine, a machinist's daughter. They laughed when she bought a tractor with no engine. What she put inside it was her father's blueprint, her own hands, and the understanding that a machine is never dead as long as someone knows how to imagine what it could become. Everything else was just decoration.